We'll show you how to use closures to create simple animations. This example will demonstrate how closures can be used to write simpler, more effective code. Let's say that we want to animate an HTML element. To do this, we'll define a function animateIt. As an argument, the function takes an ID of an element that we'll animate, and that would be called like this. First, we have to fetch the element that we wish to animate. Next, in order to animate the element, we have to make a sequence of animation steps. That is, we have to execute certain code at regular intervals. This execution will create the animation. In JavaScript, this is usually done by using the setInterval function to register a function that will be executed after a time period in milliseconds has elapsed. In this case, let's make a fixed number of animation steps. For this, we'll need a tick counter. Each time the interval function is executed, we'll increment the counter to keep track of the number of animation steps. Let's say that our animation will be over after 100 animation steps, or ticks. So in the case where our tick counter is less than 100, we'll have one behavior, and in case where it isn't, we'll have another behavior. Let's have an animation that moves the element from the upper left corner of the page to the lower right corner by the number of ticks. To do this, we modify the left and top position of the element's style. So, for example, after 50 animation steps, the position of our element will be 50 pixels from the left and 50 pixels from the top. And after 100 steps, it will be 100 pixels from the left and 100 pixels from the top. The passage of time will create the animation of a moving element. Finally, once enough steps have passed, we want to stop our animation. This is done by telling the browser to stop executing it using the clearInterval function. This function requires an identifier for the interval, which is obtained when registering the interval function. In terms of closures, when we enter the animateIt function and create a function that will be set as an interval, we also create a closure around the external variables element ID, lm, tick, and timer. This means these variables will be alive as long as the interval function itself exists. Let's study the application execution. When we call the animateIt function, we create new local variables and a new function closure around the variables. This function is registered as an interval function. Next, when the interval expires, the browser executes the registered function and the tick variable is modified. When another interval expires, the browser again calls the registered function, and so on. The variables are alive as long as the interval function is being executed. Now imagine that we want to animate two elements. We'll have to adjust the code a bit. We have added a new HTML element and a new call to the animateIt function. When we execute the animateIt function through the first call, we define four variables: element ID, lm, tick, and timer, and we create a function closure around these variables. This essentially means that this function also carries information about the current state of the variables. In the end, we also ask the browser to execute this function every 10 milliseconds. Similarly, if we execute the second animateIt call, we define new variables, element ID, lm, tick, and timer, and we create a new function closure around these variables. This function also carries information about the current state of the variables. For this newly created function, we also ask the browser to execute it every 10 milliseconds. Now we'll study a part of the application execution. Initially, we have the first animateIt call. This will define a couple of variables and a function closure around those variables. The function will be executed every 10 milliseconds by the browser. Next, we have the second call to the animateIt function. This will define a new set of variables and a new function closure around those new variables. This will also be executed every 10 milliseconds. After the first 10 millisecond interval expires, the browser will call the first function that we have registered. Because this function is a closure, along with it come all external variables accessible from the scope in which the function was created. For example, this means we access the box1 HTML element and that the current timer ID is 1. Later, when the second interval expires, the browser calls the second function that we have registered. In this call, all external variables available at the moment of function creation are accessible. This means each function works with its own set of variables. Now imagine for a second that this wasn't the case, if there were no closures. In that situation, for each animation, we would have to keep track of 3 variables: the animated element, the timer ID, and the number of ticks. So if we wanted to animate 2 elements, there would be 6 variables, 3 elements, 9 variables, and so on. This would lead to more complex code that would be more difficult to understand. With closures, this is done automatically. So each interval function gets its own set of variables automatically through closures. This significantly simplifies the code.